In honor of Women's History Month and International Women's Day, I've picked out 3 of my favorite books to share with you. These 3 books have changed my life. They've changed the way that I think, the way that I live, and the way that I work. Each of them is slightly different, but in each of these, I've been empowered, I've grown, I've changed, and at the same time I realize books are personal. And I expect that you won't agree with everything I say or everything you read in these books, and that's okay. I think that's the point, that we can learn to think critically and glean new ideas and share books and share new ideas along the way. And if we disagree with those ideas, that's okay too. The first book I want to share with you is Lean In. And this is a popular book. It's been all over the charts, all over the blogs, all over the internet, and you probably know someone who's read it and may have read it yourself. I know that it can be a bit of a controversial book, but I think that's a good thing. I think that the fact that we are starting conversations based on this book and that we are debating because of this book means there's something worth talking about with this book. There are 3 things that Sheryl Sandberg does in this book that I really like. She talks about the realities of women in leadership. She talks about why there's a disparity for women in leadership. And then she also addresses the most important part, what the next steps are in this issue. And I think that's the critical piece. It's not just about talking about the issues, but really what can we do to overcome this issue and to progress beyond this issue. So what I've done in this book, and I'll do in all 3 books, is picked out a few passages that I think are really clear to the message that the book is trying to say and might intrigue you to read more. One of the things that Sheryl says is that we cannot change what we are unaware of, and once we are aware, we cannot help but change. And to me, that's really the point of reading these books. It's one thing to be ignorant and to not understand something, but as soon as we do, we're compelled to make a difference and to change. And reading these books will put us in those places. The other part of this that I think is really interesting is this quote here that brings men into the conversation. She says, "Men of all ages must commit to changing leadership ratios. They can start by actively seeking out qualified female candidates to hire and promote. And if qualified candidates cannot be found, then we need to invest in more recruiting, mentoring, and sponsoring so women can get the necessary experience." And I think that's huge. One of the metaphors she uses about having a seat at the table. And while I may not always have a seat at the table, my colleagues and my allies do, and we have a responsibility when we have that seat to advocate for our friends and colleagues and the women we work with to make more space at the table. The second book that I've chosen is a bit older. This book was published in 2000, also a New York Times bestseller. Play Like a Man, Win Like a Woman was written by Gail Evans. I first heard about this book at the Women's Leadership Institute, and Gail was the keynote speaker. She was an incredible presenter, and I read this book on the plane on the way home because I was so excited about the message that she was sharing. The idea behind this book is that business is a game. And like any game, there are rules to winning. But at the same time, she acknowledges that the differences in the way men and women work and play, there are differences, and that we've learned these styles through the experiences we've had in our lives. But the solution isn't to act more like men so much as it is to realize that these challenges and learn how to master and prepare for them. So from this one, I've pulled out a couple passages to share with you as well. And back to the idea about it being a game. For the most part, however, the women's game was and is different from the men's. This is because men and women are wired differently and we are brought up differently, so nature and nurture. When we are adults, we work differently. It's important for women to understand these differences because the more aware we are of them, the more possible it is to gain access to power. Ignorance is never bliss. You cannot know too much. Sounds familiar? That echoes what Sheryl Sandberg was saying in her book. And the other piece, this is one that just really resonates for me and I think is a message that we need more women and more people in general to hear. Starting with, let me ask you a question. It's the worst strategy in the playbook. You never ask if you can ask, you just ask. Because we are taught to speak our mind only reluctantly, our vocabularies are saturated with such phrases as, I don't mean to interrupt you, but, or I know that you're very busy, but, or everyone may have thought of this idea before, but, or all those other phrases that end with a but. Why do we need to apologize for what we're about to say? Why can't we just say what we need to say and say it quickly? When you ask for permission to speak, you're putting conditionality instead of strength around a statement. Conditional talk doesn't have much power. That is such a powerful message, I think, that we cushion our thoughts and we apologize for our thoughts before they're even out of our mouth. And if once you're aware of this, you can't help but hear yourself saying, oh, I'm sorry, excuse me for interrupting, I'm so sorry. And it's one of those things, again, that once you're aware of it, you can't help but change it. So that is the second book, and the third book that I have picked out is I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't. Telling the Truth About Perfectionism, Inadequacy, and Power. And this is written by Brene Brown. And before I even introduce this book, I highly recommend any and everything that Brene Brown has written, has spoken. Her TED Talks are incredible. This is just the book that I happen to have in the office, but I would highly recommend all of her books, including The Gifts of Imperfection and Daring Greatly. I'm currently reading Daring Greatly again because it was so good, and I think after reading this book again to review it, I would read it again. There's just so much that you hear when you're in a different place in your life that you didn't hear the first time you read it. Different messages that hit you differently depending on the things going on in your life. In summary, this one I think is a little bit different because she is a researcher and her focus is on shame research and vulnerability. And so this book is chock full of facts and research and statistics and studies, but in a digestible and relatable way that's mashed up with people's personal stories and testimonials and anecdotal evidence that just makes it really interesting and really relatable. And she's vulnerable and shares her own stories in the work as well, which really does make it interesting. So this one is a lot about perfection, the need to have it all, to be it all, to be perfect. But at the same time, we're attracted to people who are real and who are raw and authentic, and we're not holding ourselves to the same standards. We see being imperfect as being inadequate. And for this one, I've only picked out one passage, but just about every other page in my book is dog-eared, and it was hard enough to choose this one. But this one, again, really resonated for me. When we choose growth over perfection, we immediately increase our shame resilience. Improvement is a far more realistic goal than perfection. Merely letting go of unattainable goals makes us less susceptible to shame. When we believe we must be this, we ignore who or what we actually are, our capacity, and our limitations. We start from the image of perfection, and of course from perfection there is nowhere to go but down. And that's just one of the many passages I think that makes you want to sit with it and digest it. There are pieces in the book where she encourages you to stop and reflect, and I think that's one of the most valuable parts of this book and in all of her works, is that there's a lot to digest and to process and to apply to your own life. So this is a very short list of books. It is 3 books that I've shared with you. Again, these 3. But what do you think of these books? Share in the comments. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts. And also, please share what's on your short list. What 3 books would you suggest people read to learn more about women's leadership, women's empowerment, growth, change, or anything else that's on your list? I'm always looking for new books to add to mine. Thanks for reading with me.